Hello, hello, hello. I think I should be started already. I was going to play my new intro, but it doesn't appear to be working. Let me try it out. Let's see. All right, there we go. And we should be started. Okay, let me get caught up on the live. I think I saw some comments already. Let me see. Okay, the first thing I see is the infamous Lance. I have seen this all over the place. So I tend to leave comments on all kinds of videos on moral realism, and I'm kind of branching out in the new topics. Sometimes I've been talking about consciousness, and more recently psychophysical harmony, which is related to consciousness. And I keep seeing this comment, the infamous Lance. So I seem to get all over the place commenting on there. Okay, now there's an now there is even an infamous intro. So off to a rough start with the intro. What do you think of the intro? So I was really happy with the way it turned out. I also have an outro, so I'll be playing that as well. Okay, so, and it looks like Jonathan is not going to be able to join us today. So presumably you'll be joining us on Monday when you get a chance to listen to this. So today I'm going to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart and is going back to the roots of what this channel is primarily about, which is criticizing moral realism. And today I'm going to be talking about the contents of a particular blog post that I wrote when I encountered some commentary from Mike Huemer, who's a moral realist, a non-naturalist realist. And I saw that similar content also appeared in his book, Ethical Intuitionism. So I'm just going to dive right in and get started. I don't see anybody, saying anything else in the chat, so I'll get right into it. Okay, so this is basically how Mike Huemer has argued. Huemer makes this one argument that's kind of an argument for moral realism by process of elimination. And the way that works is basically what Huemer says is, look, you only really have two choices on whether there are these stance-independent moral facts. Either there are or there aren't, And that looks like a completely legitimate and mutually exhaustive account of the logical possibilities. And I don't really have much of an objection to that in principle. One moment. My throat's a bit scratchy. I'm going to need to grab a drink in a minute. Anyway, so Huemer basically says, look, you got two options. Either there are these stance-independent moral facts or there aren't. But where I disagree with Huemer is that he goes on to say the anti-realist only has three options. And these are the classic three anti-realist options that exist in the metaethics literature. And these are relativism. I think he calls it subjectivism. So we'll go with that. Okay, so subjectivism, error theory, and non-cognitivism. And one moment again, sorry about getting off to a rough start today. One second. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so there's a few things going on in the background. So I'm trying to get a roll on here. But okay, so basically, according to Huemer, there are three anti-realist options: error theory, relativism, and non-cognitivism. And if you can make a compelling argument against all three of those, that really doesn't leave you with any option other than realism. So hence an argument by process of elimination. The problem is, I don't really think that those are the only three options. And I think it's difficult for Huemer to sustain that those are the only three options. And I think a lot of that is predicated on an underdescribed, obscure, and possibly flawed conception of the way that language and concepts work. So before I get into that, let me say briefly what these three options are and how one might say, how one might hold that these are the only three anti-realist options. So the way that works is, okay, so you start with an analysis of moral claims. Take a statement like murder is wrong. That statement, you can then say, okay, well, what do we mean by this statement? Well, if we don't mean that the statement is referencing or attempting to describe stance-independent moral facts, you could think that it's an attempt to do so, but there are no such facts. And that would give you a kind of error theory. It's kind of like if someone went around saying, unicorns like to, frolic in the meadow. Well, there are no unicorns. So the statement is false because it's presupposing the existence of unicorns. There are no unicorns. So the argument fails to refer, it fails to describe something that's actually exists. So it is attempting to describe what the world is like, and it's attempting to describe it in the way that realists are trying to describe the world. It's just that it happens to be the case that there are no such facts of that kind. So that would give you error theory. Then you have subjectivism. Now, subjectivism is routinely mischaracterized in the literature, and humor in this case, I don't think humor necessarily mischaracterizes it, but at least not in terms of describing it in the simple formulation of just what it is. I think the objections, imply what I take to be mischaracterizations, or at least, attacking specific conceptions of subjectivist accounts and not others. And the critiques don't generalize to all of them. Anyway, so subjectivism treats moral claims as having an implicit indexical element, which allows the truth status of those claims to vary as a function of what standard they are indexed to. Now, that's all just a fancy way of saying something like, when one person says murder is wrong, they're referencing their standards. And when another person is saying murder is wrong, they're referencing their standards. And those two people, as a matter of descriptive fact about what they happen to endorse, could have different moral standards. And so if one person thinks it's okay to murder people, when they say murder is morally acceptable, you could sort of translate that into the statement, murder is consistent with my moral standards. And if it is consistent with that person's moral standards, that would be true. And then another person, they could be opposed to murder. They could think it's morally wrong. And then when they say murder is not consistent with my moral standards, that would be true. So in other words, you have to take that statement, murder is wrong, and recognize that the statement, it's not explicit in the statement, but it would be very similar to something like, I am Lance. I there is an indexical word, like that word functions indexically, so that who is saying it, who it's referring to varies based on who's saying it. Specifically, I is referring to whoever is saying it. So if I say I am Lance, that would be true because I am Lance. When I make the statement, I refers to me. But if you make a statement, it refers to you. And if you're not Lance, then the statement would be false. And so what you certainly don't want to do is make the ridiculous mistake of thinking that subjectivism is obviously contradictory or obviously nonsensical because it allows for someone to assert two logically inconsistent propositions at the same time. Like, for instance, this object right here is both a square and not a square in the same respect at the same time. Or this object is both red and not red in the same way at the same time. That's not what relativism is doing. It is not saying that, for instance, it's like if I said, I am Lance and I am not Lance. Well, that would be a contradiction because both statements are referring to me. But I should stick with humorous terminology. Subjectivism allows for the statements to have an implicit component where they refer to different people. And there's no incompatibility with saying, murder is wrong according to this person and it's not wrong according to this other person, any more than it would be some kind of contradiction to say Alex likes chocolate and Sam doesn't like chocolate, or according to Sam, chocolate is good and according to Alex, chocolate is bad. There's no logical contradiction there, and that would be silly. So that gives you the subjectivist account. Now, I'm passing over a few distinctions that one could make within that category. So you could relativize the moral standards to individuals. You could relativize moral standards to cultures. And there are other types of accounts that relativize moral standards to certain sort of procedures for producing those moral standards. You could throw constructivist accounts in there. I assume humor is throwing the constructivist accounts in there, at least anti-realist constructivist accounts into that category, because they don't really fit very well with either of the other categories. So far we have error theory and we have subjectivism. And then the final category would be non-cognitivism. These days, people typically use the term expressivism. Now, these accounts, when they look at that moral claim, they say, okay, the error theorist says it's trying to describe a stance-independent reality, but it's failing to. So that's one way you could approach it. And the subjectivists, they're saying it's indexed to the standards of individuals. It's another way. But both of those accounts are cognitivist accounts. They treat the function of moral claims to be assertoric, that is, to state propositions. It's just that they differ in what kinds of propositions they are. The error theorist is agreeing with the realist that the propositions are trying to describe this reality out there outside of our minds, and it's just there isn't anything out there that corresponds to that. The relativist is saying, oh, well, it is describing things. It's just describing facts about the standards of individuals or groups or whatever.
But the non-cognitivist says, look, these moral claims, they might look like they're trying to describe a reality outside of our minds, but they're not even doing that. They're actually functioning to express some type of non-propositional content. And that content, the early version of this that's most well-known is Ayer's emotivism. So you take a statement like murder is wrong. What that really is doing, well, it looks on the surface structurally like an assertion or a sentence that's expressing some sort of proposition, some descriptive fact about what the world is like. Actually, it's just sort of co-opting or borrowing that assertoric language. And really, it's being used to express an emotional state, like disapproval of murder. So murder is wrong. You could then translate the statement into murder, boo. Now, I really think that this translation approach is an especially effective way to go about assessing what these different metaethical positions are doing. And it's also useful because it serves as a bulwark against really bad objections to these different sorts of accounts. For instance, one extremely bad objection to subjectivist accounts is that if you're a subjectivist, then you have to think that killing babies is wrong or whatever, so whatever, throwing puppies in volcanoes. Take your pick for some awful misdeed. If you're a subjectivist, you have to think it's true that it's permissible to do that. It's not true. That's bullshit. It's just straight bullshit. And it's kind of irritating that this kind of objection persists as an objection to subjectivism. Now, I get worked up about this, and I'm not even a subjectivist. I get worked up about it because it should be obvious why this is a bad objection. And yet, for whatever reason, people continue to raise this terrible objection. Here is why it's a terrible objection. So someone might say something like, look, if you're a moral subjectivist, you have to think the statement, it's okay to torture babies for fun, you have to think that that's true. Okay, no, you don't, because that statement is underdescribed. The relativist or the subjectivist could say, well, index to what standard? Do I have to think that index to my standard? Because that's not true. I don't have to think that. For comparison, imagine someone said that if you're a subjectivist, then you have to think that the statement "I am Lance" is true. That's not even meaningful. What would that mean? The sentence "I am Lance" is true. You have to think that it's true. An appropriate response to telling someone that thinks that statements involving the use of "I" have relative truth values because they're indexed, that you have to think those statements are true is that's meaningless, because you're not giving the context that would resolve what person the statement's being indexed to. Take the sentence, "I am Lance." Absent someone asserting the statement, it's literally meaningless. It has no determinate truth value. Well, maybe I shouldn't say it's literally meaningless. I should say it doesn't have a determinate truth value. And the reason it doesn't have a determinate truth value is because that "I" only acquires its meaning when it is indexed. So you can't just say "I am Lance" is true or false. It depends who is saying it. And so in order for a relativist about "I am Lance" statements, like statements about what your name is or who you are, in order for them to assess the truth status of those sort of statements, there would have to be some implicit or explicit resolution that sort of resolves, collapses the semantic wave function, so to speak, to resolve who the statement is being indexed to, so that you could then assess whether the statement is true or false. So take a statement like "murder is morally permissible." A relativist is not obligated to think that that statement is true or false. It's literally indeterminate. What they would have to say is, okay, well, relative to what standard? And then once you relativize it to a standard, you get something like murder is permissible according to, trivially, anyone who thinks murder is permissible, because that's just what it means for murder to be permissible on the relativist analysis of that discourse. And so now you could say, okay, well, according to some, evil person that likes killing people, murder, like let's just say Alex thinks it's okay to kill people. Now, the only thing the subjectivist is committed to is saying the statement "murder is permissible" is true when Alex says it. And that might sound like now they're admitting, that it's okay for Alex to murder. They are not admitting that it's okay for Alex to murder. What they're saying is that the statement "murder is permissible" is true when Alex says it, because, again, this is why that translation approach is important. We translate the statement. when Alex says murder is permissible, what Alex is saying, we just translate it. Murder is consistent with my moral standards. That's what Alex would be saying. Well, if it's consistent with Alex's moral standards to commit murder, then the statement is not only true, but it's trivially true. Alex is just saying, this is consistent with my standards. So all the relativist is committed to is saying that when people make statements about their standards, those statements can be true about their standards. That's it. What it does not do is require them to think murder is okay. And critically, it doesn't require them to think it's okay for Alex to murder. All they're required to think is that it's okay according to Alex for Alex to murder. But that doesn't mean that they, the subjectivist, has to respect, acknowledge, comply with, tolerate, or act in any particular way towards Alex. That would only be true on very specific formulations of subjectivism, specifically agent forms of relativism, where moral standards about what's right or wrong are made true by the standards of the agent performing the action. If that's the type of subjectivism that you endorse, then you may hold, okay, well, basically, if Alex thinks it's okay to murder, then it is in fact okay for Alex to murder according to any standard. Like Alex's beliefs about Alex's actions fix the rightness or wrongness of what Alex is doing. Like basically, Alex's standards determine what's correct or incorrect for Alex. And then the same would be true of everybody else. So on that type of view, if Alex thinks murder is okay, then it is in fact okay from any standpoint for Alex to commit murder. And other people potentially may be obligated to respect that fact. They would at least have to think, well, it would be good or at least permissible for Alex to commit murder, even if they themselves wouldn't commit it. And if they think it's wrong, then it would be wrong for them to commit it. And so then it would be the case that it would be permissible for Alex to commit murder, but it wouldn't be permissible for someone who thinks it's wrong to commit murder. That's agent relativism. That's kind of a weird form of relativism. If you look at like the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on moral relativism, it draws that distinction between agent and appraiser relativism. And it just says appraiser relativism is the more common kind. That's the one that's going to be assumed in this article, unless I explicitly say otherwise. Now, the appraiser relativist is just indexing the claims in a more conventional way. When Alex says that murder is wrong, that means Alex is inconsistent with when Alex says murder is permissible, what that means is murder is consistent with Alex's standards. That would be true from everybody's standards, but that has nothing to do with the principal standards or values that the appraiser relativist lives by. The appraiser relativist can judge anybody by whatever their standards are. So from the appraiser relativist, the locus of moral assessment is the person evaluating the action, not the person performing the action. And so an appraiser, it's completely consistent with an appraiser relativist framework to say, according to my standards, it's wrong for anyone to commit murder, including Alex. And so on that account, and this is the standard relativist account, it's the relativist does not have to think it's okay for Alex to commit murder. They could think it is wrong according to my standards. They don't have to think it's correct or incorrect or right or wrong. It could be right according to Alex's standards, wrong according to their own. And so this presumption that it has some sort of catastrophically stupid or terrible or obviously counterintuitive implications is dissolved when you recognize that when you translate that analysis, murder is wrong, into murder is inconsistent with there you get the indexing, moral standards, the statements end up just becoming these trivial descriptive facts about the moral standards of the agents making the claims. And is it obviously absurd? Just imagine a person says, murder is inconsistent with my moral standards, and then you get some evil person that likes murdering, and they say murder is consistent with their moral standards. What's the absurdity? They're saying things that are obviously true. For a person that thinks it's wrong, it is wrong according to their standards. For a person that thinks it's not wrong, it isn't wrong according to their standards. There's no longer any obvious absurdity here. There's what could possibly be counterintuitive about people asserting tautologies. It's as silly, it's seriously, not joking, as silly as someone objecting to the obvious absurdity of it being true when I say I'm Lance, that it's true. And if you say I am Lance and you're not Lance, that it's false. It's as absurd as that. It's as if people dealing with metaethics forget how indexicalization works. It's really bizarre because we all use indexicals all the time. I almost haven't got through a sentence without using an indexical. I keep saying I, me, we, you, we're just constantly using indexicalization. So this idea that like when it comes to relativism, suddenly people throw that out the window and don't understand how indexicals work. I don't know what's going on there, but it's really, really bizarre. It's just straight up bizarre. Okay. So those are the standard 3 anti-realist accounts: error theory, non-cognitivism, and subjectivism. I keep switching between subjectivism and relativism. I'm sorry. I'm going to stick with relativism. I don't care if humor calls it subjectivism. I like relativism. I think it's a better term. Subjectivism, like uses the term subject. I think that makes more sense for a type of individual relativism. Anyway, so those are the standard 3. Now, what humor then does is say, look, all I have to do is show that all 3 of these are implausible and realism wins by default. Now, dialectically, that's a very powerful move, but it's also very convenient because then you don't have to make a positive case for realism. Now, that's not a problem for humor because humor publishes entire papers saying, here's another argument for moral realism. So humor doesn't have that issue. Humor's perfectly willing to take on the burden of making a positive case for realism. So it's no critique of humor that there's also this process of elimination argument where you say basically your options are realism or anti-realism. If not anti-realism, then you got to go with realism. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that that type of argument derives much of its force from that humor insisting that you really only have those 3 options. And if you could knock down those 3, realism wins by default. And one way around this is to say those are not the only 3 options. You could sort of circumvent the deficiencies one might see in each of those 3 accounts by saying, look, those actually aren't the only options. The problem is it's very hard to convince people that there actually are other options. And that's what I want to do today. So let's start with what I take to be the sort of this kind of foundational problem in trying to determine what your options are for anti-realist positions. And that is, I'm not altogether clear on what it means to say moral claims mean such and such. What do we mean by moral claims? This is something that I've talked about before. And, when I look at how metaethicists deal with this question, it seems to be that they're dealing with a question that's a matter of something like conceptual analysis, or it doesn't look like they take themselves to be engaged in an empirical question. And so that presents us with a sort of dilemma. Either questions about what moral claims mean are empirical questions, in which case we're going to have to pursue that path, or they're not, in which case we're going to have to pursue that path. Let's take the latter case first, that these are not empirical questions. Okay, if that's the case, I don't know what the question's about. So I take statements like the questions about what do moral claims mean. We need to get clear on what is a moral claim. Now, I take moral claims to be the actual claims, and I take this at least, well, components of this might be controversial, components might not. Typically, philosophers, at least as far as I can tell, do take the analysis of moral claims. These are like, you could say sentences like murder is wrong, abortion is wrong, stealing is wrong. There's like both, transgressions, and then permissive, like helping people is morally good. You can take the whole gamut of positive and negative, permissible, impermissible, obligatory, prohibited, all of that type of normative language. And for right now, we're not addressing questions of like which sorts of issues count as moral issues. What sort of normative language and what sort of other language singles out which sorts of issues are distinctively moral or not. I'm setting aside those issues. I think those are actually pretty much fatal issues for a lot of this stuff, because I think they undermine much of the oomph behind a lot of these claims, and they kind of blur a lot of things. But I'm setting aside all of that, and we're saying we're taking all these like paradigmatic things, like murder is wrong, being compassionate is good, that sort of thing. Let's just grant that those are moral claims. Okay, well, up to a point. Now the question is, when we're analyzing these, what exactly are we dealing with? Are these claims that exist in some Platonic realm? Like, what exactly are we talking about? I at least have the impression that philosophers take themselves to be attempting to analyze the meaning of these sentences as they're used in everyday discourse. That is, they're not like stipulating definitions of the words and sentences that they're talking about. So they're not just saying, by this sentence, murder is wrong, I mean such and such, because then an analysis of what it means would be trivial. They could just tell you what it means. They're just saying, by this, I mean this. So what are they analyzing? I take it that they take themselves to be analyzing ordinary language and ordinary thought. Now, you can look at papers like Mixed Up Metaethics by Sennett Armstrong, and there's several other papers that give some sort of documentation of showing this sort of pattern in 20th century metaethics. You could also look at Michael Gill's paper on indeterminacy and variability in metaethics. Sometime I'll have to throw some quotes up on the screen, but a lot of prominent philosophers took themselves to be describing ordinary moral thought and language. Mackey, Ayer, Hare, lots of people you could find what look to be explicit remarks about an attempt to describe ordinary moral thought and language. Now, if what they're doing is not an empirical enterprise, I'm not entirely sure what it is they're trying to analyze. It looks to me like this is predicated on this notion that sentences have a meaning independent of the communicative intent of the speakers using those sentences. So the sentences themselves have some kind of meaning. That, I think, ends up falling victim to just being a mistaken conception of how language works. It might be based on strange notions in metaphysics. So the thing is, I could be wrong about that. Maybe it's not. So, like, in other words, if we go this non-empirical route, we need some account of what it is that philosophers take themselves to be doing, contemporary analytic philosophers. And, one thing an anti-realist can do is say, look, whatever presumptions are behind the method that you're using, I reject those presumptions. In which case, if the three traditional anti-realist accounts, error theory, non-cognitivism, and relativism, are all nested within those presuppositions about language and meaning, then if you reject those presuppositions, you're not obligated to endorse any of those positions. So from the very outset, the anti-realist can say, look, I think that the central focus of this discussion is ultimately an empirical question about the communicative intent of ordinary speakers. If your analysis of the meaning of moral claims isn't attempting to do that, then it's attempting to describe a thing that I think is either non-existent or based on confusions or errors about how language and meaning work. And so I'm not going to endorse any meta-ethical positions that are downstream of that, any realist or anti-realist positions. And in that case, then the anti-realist in this case, if they end up saying, look, I don't think there are these stance-independent facts, they're falling entirely outside the scope of this dialectic in which humor is framing these issues, saying you have to endorse one of these three positions. You only have to endorse one of those three positions if you accept the presuppositions behind them. So if someone thinks that when we're analyzing moral claims that we're doing some sort of like conceptual work that we could figure out via armchair or a priori methods, and you reject that there's any such thing as the meaning of moral claims that are, or you're skeptical that they're accessible via a priori or armchair methods, then you're rejecting the presuppositions implicit in all three anti-realist positions. You're not obligated to endorse the presuppositions. So that's one point. Now, if we shift back to the other sort of fork in this dilemma, and you want to go with the empirical route, okay, well, now we have to ask, when you say the anti-realist must think moral claims are either attempting to describe stance-independent reality, and then they fail to do so, they are relativized, or they're non-propositional, what exactly are you saying? Is it an essential or like, is it a feature of moral claims that they possess one of these characteristics? Because one might say, as a matter of identity, what it means for something to be a moral claim is to possess one or the other of these characteristics because they're mutually exclusive. It can't be the case that, at any given moral claim, both expresses a proposition and does not express a proposition. You can't be a relativist and a non-cognitivist unless you can finesse that in some way that doesn't result in the statement being logically contradictory. So if your presumption is that, look, what it means for something to be a moral claim requires, as a matter of like analytic fact, that it possesses a particular meta-normative characteristic, namely that either it's propositional or not. And if it's propositional, that either it describes a stance-independent reality or it describes a stance-dependent reality, then you are implicitly committed to what Michael Gill calls the uniformity and determinacy presumption. In this case, it's specifically uniformity that I'm referencing. And what that means is that what you're saying when you say moral claims have to either describe a stance-independent reality, describe a stance-dependent reality, or they're not propositional, so they're non-descriptive. You're saying, as a matter of analytic fact, moral claims must do either the first, the second, or the third of those, and only that, not anything else. Now, here's the problem. What if, as a matter of empirical fact, it turns out that it's not the case that people only use moral claims in one or the other of these ways? So now the philosopher might still say, okay, well, it's our role as philosophers to figure out the primary, central, or like correct, like usage of these such that we sort of clear away the refuse. We clear away the idiosyncrasies, the performance errors, the mistakes. We can set aside, philosophers that end up adopting unusual philosophical positions that aren't reflective of ordinary usage. We set aside all of that. We clear things away, and we'll find the one unified usage of moral claims. Well, what if there isn't one? This is something that Michael Gill proposes in a couple of papers. The main one being a paper, I think it's called something like Metaethical Variability and Indeterminacy. I mentioned this several times. I usually link it. I mention it a lot. It's been a big inspiration for me. And Gill says, look, if you look at the traditional dialectic throughout the 20th century, this attempt to describe what people are doing when they make moral claims, you'll have all these accounts that start with certain sorts of prototypical moral claims, or these sort of exemplars that seem really, really reflective of a particular analysis, a cognitivist or a non-cognitivist analysis, a realist or a relativist analysis. And then what they'll do is they'll say, look, these claims look like paradigmatic instances of moral claims, and my job is to explain away as a mistake all these other apparently inconsistent usages. But when you shift poles and you go over to the other side of the dispute, you look at things from the non-cognitivist perspective rather than the cognitivist perspective, the relativist perspective rather than the realist perspective. When you look at it in those terms, they could point to other seemingly central usages and say, look, these also look like prototypical usages, and I'm going to try to explain away your side of things. And so you see sides basically saying, they start with these two poles. There's stuff that looks like it's on the other end, like these outliers. They try to say everything else is an outlier. And nobody has been convinced one way or the other. And over the decades, what's happened is that realists and anti-realists have gradually, mostly anti-realists moving towards realism with things like quasi-realism, is they sort of converged on attempting to analyze language in a way that seems to be approaching a collapse in the distinction. It's unclear at this point how certain sorts of realist and anti-realist positions differ and what they take ordinary people to be doing in extremis. Now, there are still people at the edges that are like, no, language isn't the moral language is not propositional. And you still have, non-naturalist realists that are like, nope, people are using moral language to make these stance independent claims. And, quasi-realists and expressivists and everybody, they're all, out to lunch. Now, but, basically you have people that are still at the poles, but a lot of them have sort of slid towards the middle. I'm not sympathetic to those middle positions because I think they're attempting to thread too many needles simultaneously, and it's not really, my objective when trying to figure out whether there are stance independent moral facts to try to accommodate what I take ordinary people to be doing. A lot of these accounts end up not relying on any empirical assessment of what people are saying or doing at all. It's just totally floating free of any empirical engagement with what people are doing. Now, what if it turns out when we investigate empirically what people are doing with moral language, that many people are using moral language and by moral language, I mean when they're making these moral claims that we could assess in terms of their meta-normative or meta-ethical characteristics, that there isn't any singular, central, and primary function to how people are using them. Could be that sometimes, sometimes people use them to express non-propositional content. Maybe they use them to express imperatives, or they use them to express emotions without any propositional content. Sometimes they use them in a way that indexes them to their standards or the standards of their culture or whatever. And sometimes they use them to describe a stance-independent reality. If that's the case, it could turn out that all of these usages are so central and built into the way that people speak and think that any reductive account that attempted to eliminate two of the three would be leaving out a legitimate central part of the discourse. It would be failing to fully explain our observations adequately. And in that case, it would be, you could call it excessive parsimony, something like that. Parsimony that involves cutting out too much, throws out the baby with the bathwater, whatever trite phrase you want to use. So if it turns out all of these usages are central and primary, then the uniformity assumption is wrong. The assumption that there must be the single uniform usage to the language. And what you would end up with is something that's come to be referred to in the literature as metaethical pluralism. That basically it could just turn out that people use moral language in ways that are inelimitably pluralistic. Gill originally proposed the term variability, but pluralism seems to have caught on. Now, there's actually two different broad types of pluralism. One type would be inter-individual pluralism. And this is pluralism where Alex uses moral language in a way consistent with realism, and Sam uses moral language in a way that's inconsistent with realism, maybe non-cognitively, something like that. So what that would mean is that Alex has a stable tendency when making moral claims to be attempting to describe stance-independent moral facts. And when Sam is making moral claims, Sam is expressing emotions or imperatives or whatever. But there's also intra-individual variability or intra-individual pluralism. And this would be when the same individual, when they make some types of moral claims, they're expressing propositions, and and sometimes they're not. Sometimes that person is describing a stance-independent reality, and sometimes they're speaking in relativist terms. Now, the factors that could contribute to why a person might sometimes use one type of metaethical discourse, or one set of metaethical presuppositions rather than another can vary in a few ways. One way it could vary is that they have different metaethical standards for different types of moral issues. So maybe for something that they consider extremely immoral, like torturing babies for fun, they're a realist about that. They think if you disagree, you are mistaken. It is wrong. But they might be a relativist about other sorts of moral issues. So they might say, hey, on this particular issue where it's a controversial moral issue, maybe they're a relativist and they think if two people disagree, they could both be correct about that issue. There are hybrid accounts that, and you could have a type of relativism that is nested within a realist account. So the realist account could say, look, there are basically perimeters or boundaries on what sorts of moral standards could be correct or incorrect. And then within that framework, there could be multiple different standards that are all, you could say, equally correct, something like that. So you can have a kind of realism, a relativism nested within a realism. And someone could endorse a view like that. I haven't seen anybody explicitly test for that and demonstrate that that's what people have in mind. It could just be that people are, just as there are in normative ethics particularists, so people that will say, look, I think X is wrong and Y is not wrong, and neither is driven by some more fundamental moral principle. I just have this moral principle over here, this moral principle over here, and it's kind of like a grab bag. A person doesn't need to have, it's logically possible to have a kind of unprincipled intra-individual metaethical pluralism where you're like, look, I'm a realist about this issue, and a relativist about this issue, and I just am. I don't need a principle regulating which issues I'm a realist or not about. I am about this and not about that. So it could be that. It could be that there's some underlying principle that governs when the person considers an issue to be a matter of realism and when they don't. And it could be that people are just wildly inconsistent in ways that make no sense. So I've given a lot of ground here, but basically the first option that deviates from the traditional set of three metaethical positions, again, error theory, non-cognitivism, relativism, would be metaethical pluralism, which is the view that when people make moral claims, there is no single uniform account of the meaning of those statements. Instead, those statements could comport with two or more different metaethical positions, depending on the speaker or the context or whatever it is that allows them to vary. It could be interpersonal or intrapersonal variation. And these are not mutually exclusive. You could endorse both intrapersonal and interpersonal. You could endorse one or you could endorse the other. And you could endorse sub-varieties within both of those. I'm not going to get into all of those today. Someday when I talk about pluralism again, I'll get into all the varieties because I have like a big taxonomy of the different types of varieties. Okay, so that gives you one possibility that falls outside the scope of the traditional three. I'm going to pause there and have a look at comments, and then I'm going to talk about the kind of response someone might give to that. All right, let me look through the comments. One second. All right. Oh, there's a lot here. Okay, so this comment, I kind of already addressed this. Did you forget about Humean constructivism and ideal observer theories? I don't think so. I think that those would be collapsed into subjectivism. Now, that's kind of an awkward fit, but that's a limitation of terminology. As much as I enjoy criticizing realists, I don't really have that much of a problem with saying, hey, look, there's some conceivable term that we could use to capture all of these sorts of positions. What I would prefer to use for these positions is to call them stance-dependent accounts. So I think that would be a clearer way of referring to them. One reason that that's better is that some forms of relativism are actually types of realism. So relativism simply says moral standards, the truth status of moral claims is indexed. Now, it could, in principle, be indexed to standards other than the stances of individuals or groups. It could be indexed to some type of objective standard. Richard Joyce talks about this in an old supplement on anti-realism that used to be, and I think in the entry for moral anti-realism on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but it was removed in later versions, and now you could find it archived. But it's wonderful. It's like this great little supplement. And what Joyce talks about in that supplement is how the distinction between stance dependent and independent, and I think he uses different terminology, but it amounts to the same thing. So the distinction between stance dependent and independent, and the indexing versus non-indexed, those actually conceptually come apart. In principle, standards could be relativized, but according to standards which are not stance dependent. So, you could say, to take motion, for instance. Motion is relative, but in a way that isn't made true by people's attitudes or values. So right there, frames of reference matter, but it's not our attitudes or preferences that make the relative motion of an object what it is. It's, just a frame of reference. So, in that case, you can have relativism without stance dependence. And you can have, let me see if these get kind of wonky when you start thinking about them. You could have stance dependence without relativism. And that Humean constructivism and ideal observer theory, and possibly some forms of, you could say, anti-realist divine command theory. There's always disputes about whether divine command theory is a type of anti-realism or not. I just tend to say, look, it could be or it could not be, depending precisely on the structure of it. For me, if it comes down to this, for the divine command theorist, if moral claims are made true by God's stances, it's a type of anti-realism. If the divine command theorist wants to say they're not made true by God's stances, but by God's nature or something like that, then things are going to get a lot murkier and it's going to be less clear whether that's a type of anti-realism or not. But here's what's going on here. Relativism or subjectivism is not necessarily a type of anti-realism. What makes it a type of anti-realism isn't that the truth status of the moral claims is indexed to one or more different standards. What makes it a type of anti-realism is when the standards that it's indexed to are stances, are sort of points of view. As long as that's the case, it's a type of anti-realism. And in practice, I've never heard of a relativist or a subjectivist that doesn't index the moral claims to stances. I've never heard of one. It's, I guess, conceptually possible, but no one actually does this, as far as I know. If you know of someone that does this, I'd love to hear about it. So in practice, virtually anybody that's going to endorse some type of relativism is going to be an anti-realist. But it's not the indexing that makes them an anti-realist. It's the stance dependence that makes them an anti-realist. So what is left out of that formulation on Humer's account would be Humean constructivism and ideal observer theory. But I think that they're sort of implicitly encompassed within that conception. So I don't really think it's a problem with Humer's characterization. I just think we lack any sort of uniform terminology. What would be great is at some metaethic conference or something, get all the metaethicists together and we get them to hash out, let's all use standardized terminology so we can speak clearly about these issues. So again, not an objection to Humer. I think these are rolled into that. And I think that becomes clear in the book itself, where there's more room for Humer to clarify. So what are these accounts? So the Humean constructivist is going to allow for a person to be mistaken about their moral standards, even on an anti-realist account. And the way that would work is, suppose, on my view, I think what I should do is what's consistent with my goals and interests. And I happen to have this sort of overarching value. Like let's just say, for simplicity's sake, I'm a utilitarian and I want to maximize utility. And then I have some sort of downstream normative moral principle that I abide by, like don't lie or whatever it would be. And then I discover that practice actually doesn't maximize utility. Then I am mistaken about the rightness or wrongness of my action from within my own point of view. Now, this isn't a perfect characterization of Humean constructivism. It's just a kind of rough implication of the sort of thing that it allows for. And so the Humean constructivist can say, okay, well, I can update my position and recognize that I was incorrect about my position with respect to my own values. So that's a kind of thing that you could do. But, this doesn't require endorsing some sort of appraiser or agent relativism, as far as I know. In practice, I'm not sure that it would end up looking all that different, and I'm not super duper familiar with Humean constructivism. I read Street, I think, has a paper on it I read a while ago, so I might be mischaracterizing it a bit. And if you have a more accurate characterization, or I'm not characterizing it well, let me know, and I could update that in a future discussion where I could say, okay, I've had a chance to sit down and refresh on exactly what Humean constructivism is committing us to, and then I could update on that. But ideal observer theory, this is basically going to say that we should do what some sort of ideally rational and fully informed agent would favor us doing. And this is, again, a type of stance dependence, because what you morally should or shouldn't do is dependent on a stance. Now, interestingly, it's the stance of a hypothetical agent, not an actual agent, but it's still making the facts stance dependent. They're dependent on somebody's stances. Now, what's interesting about this is the ideal observer theory could say, look, in principle, everyone would converge on doing the exact same thing if they knew what a fully rational, fully informed ideal observer would favor doing. It would favor us all doing, complying with the same moral standards. And so in that case, there's actually a single correct answer to any given moral issue. Like, should you murder? Well, would an ideal observer that's fully informed and ideally rational favor murder? Well, if no, then nobody should murder. If yes, then everybody, it's okay for everybody to murder. And so the point there would be that moral claims would lose their indexical status. It wouldn't allow for the truth status of moral claims to vary as a function of which person is making the claim or what moral standard they are indexing. There would be a fact of the matter about whether moral standards are correct or incorrect that would be the same regardless of who's saying it. So it couldn't be murder's wrong is true when I say it and murder's not wrong when Alex says it. It would still be either true or false. And so it's cognitivistic, and you could say it's universal. There's a single correct standard. But critically, that standard depends on the stance of a hypothetical agent. So it's still a type of anti-realism. And in that case, where would we put that in the tripartite taxonomy that Humer has given us, which is error theory, non-cognitivism, relativism? I think we just put it in relativism and say, properly speaking, that should be called something like stance dependence. And then they're all covered. So we really should say error theory, non-cognitivism, and stance dependence, and then boom, it's covered without an issue. So, and that would cover any type of constructivist account that ultimately makes the moral facts dependent on our standards. So if someone says that, hey, I'm a constructivist and I think that the correct account of what you morally should and shouldn't do depends on following a particular procedure, and it is the procedure like a group of people would agree to under a veil of ignorance, or it's the standards that all agents would agree to, were they in a position to rationally, engage in contracts. There's different sorts of ways you could characterize the account. If it's making the moral facts dependent on the standards of individuals or groups, you still got a type of anti-realism. Now, it might be a type of anti-realism that has potentially, from its own vantage point, I might just say, I don't give a shit about these moral facts. From its own vantage point, it might still present itself as having more oomph or more force than conventional relativist accounts or error theory or non-cognitivism, but it's still not going to give you the kinds of things that a moral realist wants to give you. All right. Sorry for getting to you so late, but hello. All right. I simply lack a belief in anti-realism impressed. Well, I'm not sure what you mean. You don't endorse anti-realism? If that's what you mean, I'm not impressed or unimpressed. I don't expect everybody to endorse anti-realism. I've never seen academic philosophers use problematic objections like that. If you're referencing my objections regarding relativism, I can give you references. So, and Humer has raised these kinds of objections himself, and Humer is an academic philosopher. So yes, they do raise the types of objections. I don't know exactly which one you're referencing because this was a while ago. That was what, like 30, 40 minutes ago. But if you're talking about people taking relativism to have these obviously silly implications, that is in fact how humor deals with it. So humor's critique, when I've seen humor give a sort of quick rundown of the reason why we should reject these three anti-realist positions, strikes, I mean, there's the quick version and then there's a longer versions. But the quick version is something like this. If you're a relativist, then you think baby torture is okay, like you think it's good, that's absurd, so relativism is wrong. If you're an anti-realist, you don't think baby torture is bad, that's absurd, so that's wrong. And if you're a non-cognitivist, I don't know exactly what he says about that, but maybe he says you have the embedding or Fekete problem or something like that. I'd have to look at the objections, but that's going to be absurd too. And so boom, all three are wrong, so you get realism. So yeah, the objections often are basically suggesting that relativists are committed to the view that, you know, baby torture is good or something like that, or permissible or whatever. All right, I'm still going through comments, trying to get caught up. This is a good question. Would you make a distinction between semantics and pragmatics? It seems like a usage could refer to the pragmatic reason for a person making a moral claim or the semantic meaning of the claim. So this is not an issue that I've studied enough to have a really substantive position on it. What I can say is that there is catastrophic lack of attention to the importance of pragmatics. And this is true both in philosophy and in psychological research, where psychological, like researchers will often design studies without careful attention to pragmatics. What I can say is, and this is something that I stopped and haven't got into as much as I would like, is that I take the meaning of claims to be, I think that claims only acquire meaning through usage. And what they mean is the communicative intent of the speaker. So I don't think sentences have any meaning outside of a usage. And I think that usages are the way in which they imbue what's being stated with meaning. And I don't literally mean they imbue what's stated with meaning. In fact, I take back that language. I shouldn't fall in to the habit of reification and adopting the analytic style of attributing properties and imagining ghostly metaphysics everywhere. Here's how I think that this sort of works. When someone says something like murder is wrong, that person has some intent. There's a psychological fact about what they're intending to communicate. And murder is wrong, that sentence, when they're using it, doesn't have any meaning at all. The person means something. They have a communicative intent, and that sentence is what they're using as a tool in real time to express that meaning. So the sentence doesn't mean anything. The person means something. This is why I say words don't mean things. People mean things. And so when we ask, what does murder is wrong mean? There is no fact of the matter about what free-floating toy sentences like murder is wrong mean. We can only ask questions about the communicative intent of individual speakers or the typical communicative intent of communities of speakers. And those become empirical questions about the psychological facts about those people. What is their communicative intent? Now, the thing is, people's communicative intent, when they're using the same sentences and language, even when they're all competent speakers, they're all using the same words and the same sorts of sentences and the same structures and the same grammar, and they're competent, and they're not committing performance errors, and they're not confused, and they're not adopting idiosyncratic usage. Look at all the caveats I have to include just to try to make this point. It's really annoying. Okay, point is, people still vary in what they mean when they use words and sentences, because words and sentences don't have rigid and fixed meanings. There's no pure semantics to sentences in everyday usage. The way that people use words and phrases is incredibly flexible. It's improvised, it's context specific, it's local, it's parochial. It is always used to serve the proximal goals and interests of the person using the sentence. And that meaning can vary in small shades. You could think of every usage as somewhat unique, but largely overlapping. So the way that we would take the sentence murder is wrong is that there would be a whole bunch of Venn diagrams, a lot of them closely overlapping, and then there'd be others that are further and further from it. Sometimes someone could say it sarcastically, oh, it's not like murder is wrong, and then it would have a kind of negation of the conventional usage. And so you would have these kinds of clusters of Venn diagrams of overlapping usage, where you would get a cluster here where a bunch of the Venn diagrams are closely overlapping one another, And then you would get some usage where they're like totally separated because it actually means the opposite. And then you would get a whole bunch of those. And then that would reflect the actual facts about the communicative intent of speakers when they use the sentence, murder is wrong. You would not have one single usage. You wouldn't have one big ball in the middle and then nothing else anywhere. Or you wouldn't have one central usage where they're all overlapping and then a few outliers and then we get to toss them out. What you have is multiple overlapping clusterings. And they might not even form like one cluster here, one cluster here, one cluster over here. You might have like networks and webs of clusters that sort of blur into one another. So actual meaning in everyday discourse does not have the kind of rigid and fixed usages. And much of the function of that language is deeply embedded in the pragmatics of that's part of the speech. It's not some messy crap we have to trim off the edges of language. Pragmatics part of our freaking language. It's a central part of our language. I'm not even sure we should make the kind of this semantic pragmatic distinction. Why not just call it all pragmatics? Like that's, that maybe that's radical. And again, this is something I'm going to have to look into more. But the classic approaches I see to people talking about language and meaning, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. It's like they treat words and sentences like they're magical. Like the words and sentences have meaning. They exist in this Platonic realm, and the words and sentences themselves mean something. And our job as philosophers is to find out what the words and sentences mean. Now, if some ordinary people, some non-philosophers are using the words and sentences, who cares what they're doing? I want to know what the words and sentences mean. This is complete nonsense. Words and sentences don't mean shit. They don't mean anything. There's only the question of how are people using those words? What are they trying to do when they use those words? And those are empirical questions. And it turns out when we go and ask those questions, look, this is my thing. This is what I do. I don't sit around doing analytic metaethics. I do psychology metaethics. And people have conducted these studies. And the best studies that we've conducted so far, I still have issues with them. But what they've consistently found in the populations that they studied is a majority of people favor anti-realist positions. So this is another thing where realists will go around saying common sense, ordinary language is realist. Okay, so either that's not an empirical claim, in which case we're going to have a discussion about the underlying philosophy of language and the presuppositions you're using. Because if I reject those, you certainly can't tell me I'm committed. I must choose from your menu of pre-approved philosophical positions that rely on those presuppositions. I don't accept the presuppositions. So they can't tell me you must pick one of these three. We're not logically restricted to the positions that philosophers foist upon us. So set that aside. So we go the other route, which is that these questions are empirical. Okay, well now if we're talking about empirical questions, it turns out again that their presupposition is that there has to be this uniform usage. There isn't. There isn't any uniform usage. I don't think that there is, and I don't think the empirical evidence supports that claim. Okay, so what's the takeaway from that? Well, we have at least one option, which is an alternative to the standard three positions, antirealism, noncognitivism, error theory, and that is metaethical pluralism. But we actually have a couple more options because pluralism is not my view. So we have two more options. I want to talk about one of these. There's a great paper by Don Loeb. I think it's called How to Pull a Metaphysical Rabbit Out of a Semantic Hat, Moral Incoherentism. Maybe I've got those reversed. Moral Incoherentism, How to Pull a Metaphysical Rabbit Out of a Semantic Hat. It's a cute title. Okay, so what Don Loeb argues in there is very, very similar to the indeterminacy variability that Gill puts forward. In this case, it's not that simply that some people or some of the times people use moral language to express propositions and sometimes they don't, or that sometimes they're committed to realism, sometimes they're not, they're speaking like a relativist. Rather, it's that the language itself could, at least in some instances, perhaps most of them, when people are making moral claims, they're simultaneously committed to precisely these sorts of conflicting positions. So when a person says murder is wrong, there could be instances where that person is both saying that they are describing a stance of dependent reality and they're not, or they're both exerting a proposition and they're not. And if that's the case, then those statements would be incoherent. They're a type of, like, they're gibberish. They're not meaningful. And that gives you another type of anti-realism. I think Loeb prefers the term irrealism. And it's different because the error theorist says when people are making moral claims, they're perfectly coherent and intelligible. They're just attempting to describe a reality that doesn't exist. And this would be very similar to someone saying something like, Bigfoot tends to be over 7 feet tall. Bigfoot is an intelligible concept, but if there is no Bigfoot, then the statement is false. It's not nonsense. That would be different from somebody saying bliggity, bliggity, blah, that's not true or false. It's just nonsense. Or someone saying, I have a giant purple invisible green square that screams and doesn't scream all day long. That's not, is that true or false? Well, it's just nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. It's just confused. And so this account says, in a certain sense, that moral statements are unintelligible. I don't know. Some people, I've seen some people want to say that that's a type of error theory because people are subject to a systematic error when they're speaking. The error is an implicit commitment to logically incompatible commitments. And so everything they're saying is, I don't know if people would want to say it's false or at least that it's not true or that it's unintelligible. So in that case, you could say some people might try to wedge it into error theory. I see no reason to try to force fit it into the traditional three categories. Just let it be its own thing. So we have uniform, the three traditional accounts are all uniform accounts. Then you have pluralism. And then you have this fifth option, which is incoherentism. So if it's not clear what the difference is, it's not relativism because it's not saying that when people use claims, they're specifically and determinately indexing their claims to people's stances. It's not that. It's not saying they're not propositional because they very well, in fact, and what makes them incoherent is that in part they are intended to be propositions, but they're also intended not to be propositions. So you can't say it's a type of non-cognitivism if it's holding that lots of the language is inelimitably propositionable. I'm messing up my language here. Propositionable. It's inelimitably propositional. So sorry, I'm goofing up the language here. I need a break because I'm just going for like an hour. All right, I'm gonna take a break. 1 second. Give me 1 second. I'll be right back. Okay, sorry about that. I desperately needed a break. I've been going for an hour straight. Okay. I am back. Where was I at? Oh, right. So I was talking about these two alternatives, which is pluralism and incoherentism. There is actually a third position available, and it's my position, which is metaethical indeterminacy. And this position, again, this is something that was put forward by Gill in that paper, indeterminacy and variability. Indeterminacy is the view that ordinary moral claims are not committed to any particular metaethical position at all, or at the very least. And you could break this up into a kind of like a deeper type of indeterminacy where there is no fact of the matter in principle, or a kind of epistemic indeterminacy where if there is a fact of the matter, it's underdetermined by the available evidence, or there's no way of resolving it in practice. You could call that, epistemic indeterminacy. That's not what I endorse. I think that when people are making moral claims, like ordinary people in ordinary contexts, most of the time, there is no implicit commitment to any particular metaethical position. I just don't think it's a central or primary function of moral language to express statements or verbal acts. They're not their speech. The function of the speech acts is not to do anything that determinately and decisively fits with the traditional metaethical accounts. Now, if that sounds weird, Gill gives a comparison in the paper where he says, okay, well, just imagine people are making mathematical claims. 2 + 2 = 4, 7 is a prime number, whatever. When people are making those claims, do we imagine that they are implicitly committed to either Platonism or anti-Platonism about mathematics? Probably not. He says something like, everyday mathematical claims, just they're not in the business of making the sorts of claims that have anything. They don't have any built-in metaphysical presuppositions in them. It's just they're not in the business of doing that sort of thing. And this sort of everyday speech just it gives us no purchase on addressing those questions. That's just not what they're doing. My preferred example is to talk about causal claims. So imagine a person is saying something like, hey, I think it's going to rain tomorrow. And then another person goes, I don't think it's going to rain tomorrow. Now you imagine that dialogue and ask yourself, when those people are making those claims, which account of quantum mechanics are they committed to when they say, I think it's going to rain tomorrow? Because they've got a few options here, right? So you could think that they're committed to the many worlds interpretation, and they both agree that the universe will split into two, and it maybe in most of those worlds it won't rain or it will rain, and then in most of those other worlds, the opposite will happen. And so what they think is that the collapse of the wave functions are characterized by this distribution of future worlds, and there's this branching chains of all these different billions of universes, and most of them will have a preponderance will go one way or the other. Maybe they're committed to that. Alternatively, maybe they're Copenhagians and they think it's fundamentally indeterministic. So we could go around analyzing everyday causal claims to try to figure out which of these positions people endorse, or maybe they endorse like a Bohm, like a hidden variable interpretation. That'd be ridiculous. When people are making causal claims, they're not trying to do anything that commits them to any of these views. They're not committed to any of those views. It's just not the purpose of the language to commit one to any particular account of quantum mechanics. And my suggestion is that this is largely true of moral claims as well. So when people are making moral claims, they're just not making claims that are in the business of trying to describe a stance-independent reality, or trying to describe their own values, or trying to describe, they're trying to express a particular non-propositional attitude. They're not specifically doing any of those things. So you could ask the question, well, what are they doing? Well, one, I think that's an empirical question. And two, I think it's going to be something like a highly deflationary, goal-specific type of thing that they're doing. It's going to be characterized in largely descriptive terms that are cashed out in terms of the socio-functional goals of the person in the moment that they're using that particular language, that particular discourse. So what I mean by that is if a person says, well, that's wrong, there's no fact of the matter whether they're describing an objective reality or referencing their own standards or expressing an emotion. Rather, that language is serving a contextual role in achieving some sort of social goal that the person has. Now you could say, okay, well, then they're not expressing a proposition then. So they're a non-cognitivist. I don't know that I would characterize it that way. It depends what exactly you mean when you say that the sentence is propositional or not. Again, I think fundamentally the problem here is that when philosophers are talking about the meaning of moral claims, I think that they're imagining a conception of the way that language works that I just don't think is the way the language works. So I think that what we really should be doing is, if we want to know what people mean when they use these sorts of claims, is do empirical research. But I think that research is going to reveal that language is not really serving. It doesn't have any sort of uniform metanormative characteristics that are driving the sentences, as though what people are trying to do when they make moral claims is deploy a metaethical theory. If not not consciously, of course, but implicitly. They're trying to apply I'm a relativist, so I'm going to apply it in this way. Or I'm a realist, I'm going to apply it in this way. Now, I'm not saying unconsciously they are thinking, I am a realist, I better use the language this way, but rather that they happen to just take it that the language is descriptive of a stance-independent reality, so that's how they use it. And they haven't really reflected on or thought about it. That's just how they use the language. But I don't think anything about everyday normative claims, even from a sort of external descriptive account, best fits one or the other of these analyses. It looks like they all can accommodate the descriptively, like what people appear to be trying to do. But that to me is just doing really crappy psychology. If we want to figure out what people are trying to do, why would we just analyze like the surface structure of the sentences they're using when we're asking psychological questions? That would be like trying to examine the nature of pain exclusively by analyzing like English sentences. Think about how ridiculous that would be to try, oh, let's understand pain. Imagine trying to do psychology exclusively by like, I don't know, corpus analysis of people's diaries or something. That would be a very bizarre way to do psychological research. There's a reason we have cognitive psychology and social psychology and personality psychology and behavioral neuroscience. You know, we have all these disciplines because there's multiple methodological approaches that allow us to corroborate the kinds of theories that would give us a deeper, richer, and more explanatorily adequate account of what pain actually is. You know, we're not going to be able to figure out what pain is from the grammatical analysis of prototypical pain sentences that we examine a priori. That'd be so beyond ridiculous. I don't even know what to make of that. And so if we're trying to analyze the meaning of moral claims, why would we do this by armchair analysis? Why wouldn't we get into the messy work of actually doing the empirical research? We should be doing cognitive psychology. We should be doing social psychology. We should be doing qualitative and quantitative approaches. We need multiple converging lines of empirical research on this. And I see no reason to think that the answers are going to turn out to be that people are going around deploying metaethical theories. But there's so much under specificity in what philosophers take themselves to be doing, they don't even know what they're doing. And it's not clear to me that they know what they're doing. They're analyzing these sentences. Well, take the typical approach. It's to analyze sentences. So the problem with the way that they're approaching that, and why I've become so convinced that what they're doing relies on mistaken presuppositions about how language works, is because I see language, these sorts of sentences, as only deriving their meaning in a context of usage. So if we wanted to know what people mean when they make moral claims, what we would do is analyze them in their actual context of usage. For comparison, let's say you wanted to study tiger behavior. Would the proper way to study tiger behavior, or we could take any animal you want, wolves, bears, lions, seals, fish, whatever. Let's say you wanted to study tiger behavior. You could kill a tiger, throw it in a room and then watch it. That's not going to work. It's a dead tiger. It's not going to do anything that a tiger would do in the wild. You could, take tigers and put them in captivity. You could put it in a cage and then observe it and go, now we're going to find out about tiger behavior. Or you could create a really complex simulation of a tiger and then analyze that thing's behavior. But how would you create an accurate simulation unless you already knew exactly what tiger behavior was like? So the simulation is not going to work unless you've already done the empirical work of observing what? Tigers in the wild. If you want to know how tigers behave like a tiger, and the analog to everyday usage is, if we want to know how people are using moral language, like everyday moral language, we need to study it in its everyday contexts. For the same reason, the only way to study the actual behavior of a wild tiger is to study it in its typical ecology. You can't kill the tiger. You can't extract it from that ecology, throw it in a cage, and then think that because of it acts one way in a cage, that it acts that way in the wild. And complex simulations that are not based on actually, modeling what tigers are doing given real world observations of their behavior in their typical ecology, those simulations are never going to be accurate. And yet this is analogous to what philosophers are actually doing. So philosophers will take moral sentences and extract them from their context of usage. They're not studying actual instances of people making moral judgments in the real world or making moral claims in the real world. What they're doing is they are studying the sentences in isolation. And what information are they using to assess the meaning of those sentences? Well, what they're not doing is asking the people that use those sentences. So let's say Alex is an everyday person in the everyday world, and they're watching the news and they see that somebody got murdered and they go, that was terrible. Or they hear something good and they go, that was wonderful what they did. Someone saved somebody's life or something. That's an actual instance of real world moral language. So what we could do is say, hey, Alex, what did you mean when you said that? And then Alex would go, what do you mean? I said it was good. And then we could get into a discussion and maybe we get into a Socratic dialogue and we try to figure out what Alex meant. That would be an actual engagement with everyday language. But that's not what philosophers do. They don't go and ask people. They just think about it. They just go, well, based on my knowledge and my experience, how do I think ordinary people use language? And philosophers frequently feel that they are entitled to or endowed with the ability to make accurate inferences about what ordinary people mean, even though they themselves are not ordinary people. Also, keep in mind, what the hell do they mean by ordinary people? Who are they talking about? Is it English speakers? Is it adult English speakers? Is it people in their particular culture? This is something I recently wrote a blog post on this, where I talked about how philosophers will make claims about how ordinary people think. And, Hume himself has said most people throughout history were moral realists. How does humor know that? How do you know? You've analyzed what people mean in every language all through history? That would require an extraordinary, breathtaking scope of research. Or we could just be really, really confident that the way that we think about things generalizes not only to everybody in the world, but everybody, like currently, but everybody throughout history. That is a wildly presumptuous and not based on, again, I take this to be an empirical claim. If you want to say people in the past were moral realists, that's an empirical claim. What is the evidence for that? Well, bottom line is there's very, very little evidence that that's true. We don't have good evidence that everybody had moral concepts. It's not even clear what the hell a moral concept is. I mentioned that earlier that I was going to pass over that, but it's just we don't have good evidence for that. We don't have good evidence that everybody's a moral realist in the past. And people say things like, but most people were religious. Okay, doesn't mean they were realists. How do you know they were realists? Most people in the past used causal language. Does that mean they endorsed Copenhagen or many worlds interpretation? I don't know. I don't think so. I think they didn't endorse any of those. So just because people were, believed in gods doesn't mean that they were realists. That's not a logical entailment. You could say, oh, well, the Catholic theology. But yeah, okay. Historically, what proportion of people were really deeply familiar with Catholic theology? Also, no, most of the theologies that people making these sorts of claims, like, well, theologically, everybody would be realist. In which religions? Monotheistic, like Judaism, Christianity, Islam? Okay, were most people historically one of those three? I don't think so. So you had all these other religions were ancient Greeks moral realists? I have no idea. How would we know that? So, philosophers will make these claims that are supposed to generalize to everybody based on what? Their personal experience talking to people, talking to their colleagues, talking to their students. Most of these people have been trained in analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy is primarily, almost by definition, this term analytic philosophy, well, what is that? Well, it's a term that's used to distinguish it from continental philosophy. What do we mean by continental philosophy? Mostly philosophy that emerged and developed in France and Germany, continental Europe. So analytic philosophy is very closely approximated by, if you just said Anglophone philosophy, like the philosophy of people in predominantly English-speaking countries. So we are talking about a highly idiosyncratic population. Hinnerkine and Noren Zion's work on weird populations, as Western-educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic populations, shows that people from weird populations tend to anchor one or the other end of the extreme end of a distribution along numerous psychological dimensions. They're reliably found to be psychologically unrepresentative of most of the world's population. They only make up people from weird populations 12% of the world's populations, and yet the vast majority of research in psychology is done on weird populations. Same thing with analytic philosophical tradition. It's predominantly people from an extremely narrow cultural background. And so when philosophers say their experience and their discussions and their knowledge of everyday interactions is sufficient to generalize to the rest of the world's population, it's not. We can't even do that effectively when we've done psychological research on tens of thousands of people within the United States, and this is with like rigorous quantitative research where we don't even, the research assistants gather the data, and so that you don't have expectancy effects, and you're minimizing bias, and the data is all recorded, so you don't have errors in memory. Philosophers aren't doing any of that. They're relying on what amounts to personal experience. Now, if it works for philosophers, if philosophers are equipped just by thinking about it to make general claims about human psychology, then what do we need empirical psychology for? Psychologists can just sit around and just tell you what human psychology is like by thinking about their interactions and conversations with people. Now, if that seems ridiculous, which it should seem ridiculous, why is it any less ridiculous for philosophers who aren't even gathering empirical data? It's even worse. And if anything, philosophers go even further in terms of being idiosyncratic in that they all tend to train and study using the same canon of texts. They all read Kant and Plato and Aristotle and Kant and Aquinas and they all tend to read the same work. Again, mostly from people from their own population. So they're outliers among outliers among outliers in terms of how they think and who they speak to. And then they're going to make general claims about the entire rest of human psychology, not only of every culture and of everybody around the world, but also everybody throughout history. What on earth? What gives them the power to do that? And the thing is, here's what's funny about that. Let's say philosophers, they're just so good at thinking about stuff and introspecting on these on these sorts of things that they actually are reliable judges of how everyone thinks. The only way for us to confirm that would be with empirical evidence. Like we would need to get evidence. So all these philosophers, they all tend to agree, here's what people tend to think. Well, we could go out and do empirical research and then confirm that and then like keep testing it. And look, if philosophers get it right the first 20 times, I'm willing to grant, okay, great. Philosophers really are just like super mega psychologists, and they just know how everybody thinks by thinking about it. Fine. Do we have evidence for that? No, we don't even come close to having evidence for that. So, we're very, very far from that. So why do I think ordinary moral discourse is indeterminate? Well, I think that the categories that philosophers have come up with are basically made up. They reflect artificial distinctions that are not features of the way ordinary people speak or think. They don't serve any practical or functional role in the way that ordinary people speak or think. And they're just not a feature of what people are saying or doing. Give me one moment. So to bring this back around, on Hume's view, you have this kind of process of elimination approach where you say, all right, there are only three anti-realist positions, and our only options are either realism or anti-realism. So if I can show that the three anti-realist positions are wrong, realism wins by default. And those three anti-realist positions are error theory, non-cognitivism, and error theory, non-cognitivism, and relativism. And then what Hume will do is present an argument against each one of those positions. Now, a big part of the dialectical force of that approach relies on the contestable, because I think a lot of the weaknesses aren't really weaknesses, on the weaknesses of those three anti-realist positions. But I don't endorse any of those positions. Now, why don't I endorse any of those positions? Well, part of the problem with these positions is all of them take whether the anti-realist position in question to turn on a semantic thesis about the meaning of moral claims. But I don't think that an anti-realist position requires a position on the meaning of ordinary moral claims. What if you said, look, I have no idea what people are doing or saying or thinking or what they mean when they make moral claims, but I sure as hell think whatever moral realists are talking about, that's a bunch of nonsense. I don't believe in that. You're an anti-realist, and you didn't pick one of those three positions. So it's just not true that you're required to take up, you could be a semantic agnostic. I take anti-realism to be the view that there are no stance-independent moral facts. Now, that doesn't turn on your account of language. You could just not know. But you could also just think that the question of what do moral claims mean is underdescribed and possibly doesn't have a determinate answer. So, and you have a few other options. So you could say, well, if you're a pluralist, you could say, sometimes people use moral language in a way that's relativist, sometimes expressivist, sometimes realist. And in that case, you could have a kind of hybrid account. And this is one thing a critic might say is pluralism doesn't really reflect any type of alternative to the traditional three positions. It's just a view that says it's a combination of the traditional three positions. And that's all pluralism amounts to. So it's not really distinct. Now, I think that even if you want to go that route and say it's not genuinely a departure from the traditional three accounts, I do think it starts to put cracks in the standard edifice, which treats the analysis of moral claims as some sort of like analytic fact about what those claims mean, where they're all presumed to have a shared and uniform meaning. I think that's wrong. So at the very least, I think it gets you to start getting the gears turning that there might be something wrong with the traditional accounts. But even if we want to say the pluralist account is not genuinely a departure from the traditional accounts, fine, set it aside. Now let's look at incoherentism. Again, someone could say it's not really a departure from the traditional three accounts because all it's saying is that it's just taking combinations of the views. So the traditional views, error theory and relativism are both cognitivist accounts, and non-cognitivism is of course a non-cognitivist account. And the incoherentist is saying something like someone could simultaneously be committed to one of these and to one of these, and so the position is incoherent. And so the critic could again say all this is doing is it's sort of mixing and matching the traditional accounts. So to give a kind of goofy analogy, the traditional accounts would be something like saying all fruits are apples, all fruits are bananas, or all fruits are oranges. And if someone came along and said, actually, that's not true, some fruits are apples, some are bananas, and some are oranges, that's not that big of a departure. It's just saying it's a combination of the traditional three, but you're not introducing any new fruits. You're not denying there are any fruits. You're just sort of saying it's a mix. It's a mixed bag. That would be your pluralism. Incoherentism would be saying, look, this is like saying something is like an apple and not an apple, or it's an apple banana, and then you can say, well, that's nonsense. So then those positions would be wrong. Things can't be apple bananas or apple non-apples. That would be incoherentism. But what about indeterminacy? Indeterminacy says, there's no fact of the matter about whether it's an apple, a banana, or an orange. And for me, this position is motivated by a recognition that the question itself is conceptually flawed. The question, I mean, on two accounts. One is that it's conceptually flawed if the presumption is that there's some sort of analytic fact about the intrinsic meaning of moral claims. I don't think moral claims have any meaning. And so we would then have to shift over to an empirical question. Is there an empirical fact about whether people, with the communicative intent of speakers, are they using moral claims to express propositions that are describing a stance-independent reality, to describe a stance-dependent reality, or are they expressing non-propositional content? Now, I do think that it's plausible that there are pockets of discourse that are determinately used in a way that fits one of those three analyses. But I also think that the vast majority of the time, people aren't using it in any particular way at all. And that an accurate description of what people are trying to do doesn't require coming down one way or the other with respect to that question. And so in both cases, whether it's the flawed conception of language account or the empirical account, I think that the answer is it's none of the above. And that, I think, represents a genuine departure from the traditional three anti-realist positions, as well as incoherentism and pluralism, because it's predicated on something that's more closely approximating what I take to be a kind of quietistic account, which is to say, which is partially motivated by an appreciation for the fact that what I take philosophers to be doing in many cases is taking ordinary terms, phrases, and language, and they're extracting them from their everyday context of usage and then redeploying them in a philosophical context, and then treating them as though the meaning of those sentences transfers from the everyday context into the philosophical context. And then they're trying to figure out what the meaning is in that isolated philosophical context. The problem is, by extracting them from their everyday context of usage, the everyday context of usage is what gave them their meaning in that context of usage. And because those terms and phrases only have meaning in a context of usage, you can't take them outside the context of usage and then ask what's their meaning outside the context of usage. Doesn't make any sense. For example, imagine trying to take a rule like en passant or something from chess, like the rules about how a bishop moves. It has to move diagonally and a rook has to move in straight lines. Imagine taking the rule, the bishop must move in a diagonal line, outside the context of chess and try to apply it and ask what it means outside a game of chess. What on earth would that even mean? That rule, the bishop can only move diagonally, insofar as it has a meaning in chess, has a meaning in virtue of its relation to the other, like the rest of the rules in chess. It's a sort of community-based rule. It's a community-based meaning where its meaning is interdefined in terms of the web of other rules that comprise the game. If you took that rule outside of the game, you can't, in a certain sense, you can't really do that. If you tried to remove it from the from the game, you're just left with something that doesn't make any sense. And try to apply that to some other context. And I've made jokes about this before, but it'd be like you can imagine the police showing up and arresting like a real world bishop because they were caught walking in a straight line. You got to move diagonally, and you weren't. We're going to arrest you now because you broke the rules. That'd be nonsense. The rule you can only move diagonally only makes sense in the context of a game of chess. It doesn't make sense outside that context. And I take all language to be this way. And so an everyday moral claim has its meaning only in virtue of what it's being used for in the social context in which it's used. And so the only way to ask what that sentence means is to ask, how is the person using it? What are they trying to do? What's their communicative intent? And so when philosophers go and they analyze the sentence, murder is wrong, outside that usage, just doesn't make any sense. Now I'm repeating myself. So I've gone through all the different alternatives, and I think indeterminacy is the most plausible one, because I think it's the one that makes the best sense of the methodological flaws in the way that philosophers approach their analysis of ordinary language. And I think one of the advantages that indeterminacy has is that it doesn't require us to commit ourselves to a specific account of the meaning of ordinary moral claims in order to reject moral realism. We can just say, look, we don't think that there are stance-independent moral facts, and that does not turn on what ordinary people mean when they make moral claims. It'd be really weird to insist that it does, and I don't think we need to do that, so I don't. Okay, so I'm done with that topic. Let me look at what people have said in the comments since then, and then I can address any questions or comments and see if anybody has anything to say. I didn't see too many additional comments. I see here, it looks like Justice has already left, but yeah, words mean things is clearly a Morian fact, which is said with a sarcastic tone. So Morian facts are just question begging in argumentative form, so I don't take them very seriously. How do you respond to the water is H2O argument semantic externalists make? I don't know. I'd want to hear the argument. You know, I'm not gonna try to simulate the argument in my head and then respond to it. If a semantic externalist wants to talk to me, that'd probably be the best way for me to address that. So if you want to give me something to read, I'd be happy to address it in a future stream. I don't want to try to simulate a really crappy version of what I think that they might be saying and then straw man the hell out of it and then respond to that. I think it'd be best to engage with it explicitly, which is really just a lame way for me to not address this immediately. But I think we're coming close to the end of the stream anyway, and you asked us, almost a half hour ago. But I'd be happy to address it if it gets fleshed out some more, especially in a future stream. All right. If we're talking about descriptive metaethics, we cannot have some commitment. No. I'm sorry. I think there might be too many negatives in there. Cannot, no. I think an example of quantum mechanics works in that case. If you can clarify, I'd be happy to address that one because it is based on something that I just said. Oh, right. Oh, this is a great question because it's one that I get all the time. This is like a companions of guilt kind of question. Hey, Lance, I have a bit of an off-topic question. A moral realist, non-naturalist, said that if I reject stance-independent moral facts, I have to reject epistemic facts. Is that true? Here's the problem with that. So what do they mean by epistemic facts? Do they mean stance-independent epistemic facts or just epistemic facts? Because companions and guilt arguments, if they're trying to maintain some type of argument for moral realism, like the claim that there are stance-independent moral facts, that's going to require some sort of parity premise between the supposed existence of stance-independent moral facts and stance-independent epistemic facts. So often what I'll see when people construct these arguments is they just move to epistemic fact and they don't continue to maintain the explicit usage of stance-independent. I don't like that because I think it allows for equivocation or like subtle maneuvering in these arguments. So I prefer if they would have to mean stance-independent fact. Otherwise, it's just not true. Like it just straightforwardly doesn't follow because you could endorse stance-dependent or anti-realist accounts of epistemic facts. That's not something that you lose, even if the parity premise were true. So what these accounts try to do is they try to say, look, whatever reasons you have for rejecting the existence of stance-independent moral facts, like moral realism, would similarly apply to epistemic realism, the idea that there are stance-independent epistemic facts. And so if you're going to reject one, you would have to reject the other. Now, there's at least a weak and a strong form of this. The weak form of this is, well, you probably already endorse epistemic realism, and so there would be an inconsistency in your position. And the best way to resolve that would be to just accept moral realism alongside what you already endorse, epistemic realism. I guess a kind of intermediate strength one would be that's super implausible. It's super implausible to reject epistemic realism. You'll be biting a big bullet to do that. And so you don't want to bite that bullet, so you should accept moral realism. So to get, make clear what's being said here. The moral realist is saying, oh, you want to reject moral realism? Well, if you wanted to reject moral realism, you would have to reject epistemic realism. Now, the lowest level reply would be for someone to go, oh, shit, I didn't realize that. I don't want to reject epistemic realism. I guess I got to accept moral realism. So that'd be the lowest level one. It'd be like a consistency or an internal critique based on the person's own views. The mid-level one would be, it would be extremely implausible or be absurd to reject epistemic realism. So it puts a lot of pressure on the moral anti-realist to continue rejecting moral anti-realism if consistency would demand that they also have to reject epistemic realism. That, though, turns on it being implausible, like there being some problem with rejecting epistemic realism. And this gets us to the third and strongest form, which is to argue that it would be self-defeating to do that. And the idea behind that would require us to say something like, you're only justified in rejecting moral realism if there's an epistemic, if there's a stance-independent epistemic normative fact such that you're like objectively justified or stance-independently justified on epistemic grounds in rejecting moral realism. And on that view, you could say that the normative realist the moral anti-realist, there's no way to explicitly reject moral realism and be justified in doing so, because the only way to do that would require stance-independent epistemic justification. But if it's true that if you reject moral realism, you'd have to reject epistemic realism, then you couldn't meet the requirements for being justified in rejecting moral realism. You would be asserting something that would entail self-defeat. I think these are all terrible arguments. I mean, one, I don't already endorse epistemic realism. So the consistency concern, the lowest level concern, would never apply to me. Someone would go, oh, well, it's inconsistent with your commitment to epistemic realism. No, it's not. I don't have a commitment to epistemic realism. So that's out. So the mid-level one, it's super implausible. No, it's not. I don't think it's implausible. And the third one, there's more to say on this. This is not like the final and decisive response. No, it's not. Done. There's more to say. And then the third one, I don't think, and this is the one I want to address, because I think it's really bizarre. Moral realists and normative anti-realists more generally seem to think, if you're a normative anti-realist or a moral realist, whatever, that you can reject the existence of these stance-independent normative facts, but what you can't reject is that you need them in order to have justification or whatever. No, I can reject that too. I don't think justification, whatever kind of justification I'm going to work with, requires that I meet those standards. Something's very weird about this. It seems like realists seem to think that you can only reject part of their position. You can reject kind of the surface level, but you can't reject the presuppositions behind it. Nonsense. I reject all of it. It's all nonsense. I reject that I need stance-independent epistemic normative facts in order to be justified. Like, what the hell do they mean by justification? Are they just baking realism into that? Well, I reject that. I don't think I need that. And if I need it, what do I need it for? And, you know, an extremist, if they really are just going to insist, look, I'm just going to stipulate that from now on, what everybody means by justification just is stance-independent justification. Okay, then then I'm not justified. And I don't care. I can just come up with my own shadow lexicon and say that I'm schmustified. And okay, then I'm schmustified and not believing it. Now what? Now what are you going to do? I mean, what I think a lot of these objections reveal is either that philosophers are helping themselves to presuppositions that they think that the opposition is required to accept, or they think it would. Well, one, they think that they're required to accept them. They're not. We could just not accept whatever we feel like or whatever we're not compelled by. I mean, I'm not saying I make these choices willy-nilly. Like, I just go, oh, that would be inconvenient for my view, so I'll reject it. I don't do that. I haven't heard good arguments for any of these positions. I haven't even heard intelligible accounts about what the hell any of this means. So I'm certainly not going to endorse it. I don't know what they're talking about. And as far as I can tell, I can navigate philosophically just fine without any of these implicit presuppositions or commitments or anything. It seems like I could get all the job I want done of making accurate predictions and understanding the world and modeling reality and achieving my goals and doing all the things I want to do without positing any of the metaphysical mumbo jumbo that realists seem to be committed to. So I don't see the need for it. And if they want to say so what it comes down to is certain sorts of like terminological labels, given some stipulative usage that philosophers have come up with, they wouldn't apply them to me. This is the equivalent of saying, I, as a realist, give a gold star to anybody that uses language with the same metaphysical commitments as I do. You're not using the language that way. And if you refuse to do so, I won't give you a gold star. You won't get my gold star. That's what it amounts to. And if that sounds silly, I really think it comes down to that is an attempt to dictate metaphysics by dint of coercive force about what words mean, as if reality conforms to the way they think language works. So one, I don't think language works that way. But two, even if we did use the words that they want to use to refer to the things they wanted to refer to, okay, well then I'll just use different words. Like, I'm just not going to play the language game that I take a lot of analytic philosophers to want to play. And I think it reveals the vacuousness of a lot of these objections. They come down to, well, if you don't want to use words the way I do, then you're not using words the way I want you to. Like, it's empty. And that's what I think a lot of these objections amount to, is just piles of empty words. So that's a long way of saying that my response to Companions and Gill arguments is these pose no threat to moral anti-realism, because the threat is supposed to be that you'd have to embrace normative anti-realism. I already did before I ever heard these arguments. I think normative anti-realism is the correct position. I think normative realism is nonsense through and through across all normative domains. And I don't think there's a good case for any of it. I deny that it's self-defeating to reject that. I deny that I need to meet any of the standards they think I need to meet. I deny that they have any good arguments for this. And if they want to say, oh, but that's radically counterintuitive, okay, I deny that too. Radically counterintuitive to who? To you? I don't care about your intuitions. I got my intuitions, you got yours. Your intuitions aren't better than mine. And so if they want to say, oh, but my view is the common sense view, great. Now you're stepping in my territory. You want to make empirical claims about what most people think? Prove it. Prove most people endorse epistemic realism. As far as I know, there's no studies, supporting that. At the very least, I could tell you there's no comprehensive and decisive empirical literature reliably demonstrating that the vast majority of ordinary people across all cultures and languages all through history, that's too strong of a claim perhaps, but there's not any good evidence that any substantial majority of people use epistemic language in a way consistent with epistemic realism. That's not a literature that's been established. So if moral realists want to make empirical claims about what people think or mean, then okay, show that that's what people are actually doing and thinking. And then at least you'll have common sense on your side. But realists will just claim that they have common sense on their side without doing anything to show it. So, and I don't think the evidence supports their view. So we have research by Pulsar Wright, we have research by Taylor Davis. The best empirical evidence doesn't really show what I think that they think that it shows. So that's how I respond to companions and Gill arguments. I just say, yeah, the easiest thing to do is just accept normative anti-realism. And if someone wants to say that it has implausible implications, okay, what are those? What are the implausible implications? I don't think there are any. So one of the things dialectically that will happen in these sorts of discussions is an attempt to try to insist that if you're an anti-realist about morality or about normativity more generally, that this has radically counterintuitive implications. And this points to a concern that I'm constantly raising. Philosophers saying something is intuitive or counterintuitive, or it's consistent or inconsistent with common sense thinking. If you're making claims about common sense thinking, those claims are empirical. Present the empirical evidence that people think that way. I don't think they have any good empirical evidence that people think that way. If anything, if we're going to say that the evidence points one way or the other, it mostly points towards the majority of people surveyed being anti-realist. Now, I don't take that to be especially diagnostic because I have methodological concerns about that research. And I think that research probably suffers various types of sampling bias. So here's one concern. A lot of the research is done on online survey platforms like Amazon's Mechanical Turk, and people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk tend to be disproportionately likely to be atheists or agnostics. And Goodwin and Darley's research shows, and not surprisingly, that anti-realism seems to correlate with being non-religious, or you could say vice versa, that religious people are more likely to give realist responses to these sorts of questions. And so the populations that have been surveyed might not be representative of the rest of the world's populations. What I can say, though, is that research, and again, I think this has been mostly in college students when they've done cross-cultural research. They have done a little bit of metaethics research in other countries. They've done, I think, Poland, Ecuador, China, and a few other places. And you find, at least for certain sorts of paradigms, similar anti-realist response rates. Again, though, I have major methodological concerns with that research. It's certainly something I'll be talking about in future episodes. But it's like, okay, so if you want to reject the research as methodologically full, then we don't have any solid evidence one way or the other, in which case we're not justified in saying most people are realists about morality or epistemology. If we do have evidence, if we do take the evidence at face value, then we have evidence that they're not realists about these things, at least the populations that have been surveyed. What we do not have is high quality and convincing empirical evidence that the majority of people are more realist or epistemic realists. We don't have that. That's not a thing realists have. And I don't know why they're so convinced that that's how people think. I don't know why they think that. So I don't know. I don't know where that's coming from. All right, let me see if there's other questions. All right, so let's go back to this one, because there was some clarification. If we're talking about descriptive metaethics and we cannot have some commitment, no, I don't think example of quantum mechanics works in that case, or am I missing something? The clarification is, what I mean is that if the question is, what do people mean when using moral language? I believe there's a fact of the matter about that. I understand your indeterminacy view to say that it's not the case. So I'm not saying there isn't a fact of the matter about what people are doing. What I'm saying is that I don't take that fact of the matter to decisively result in them being committed to realism or some type of anti-realism or whatever. Like I should say, they're not. I don't think that there's a determinate fact of the matter about whether people are intending to describe stance-independent facts, stance-dependent facts, or to express non-propositional content. Rather, I take the content of what people are doing, like what people mean in those circumstances, to just not fit any of the traditional analyses. I think people have other sorts of predominantly socio-functional goals and sort of local proximal goals that would be cashed out in terms of the communicative intent of the person in the social context in which they're using those particular sentences. So, in some cases, this could be like, for instance, persuasive rhetoric. So what people are trying to do is to convince people to do a particular sort of thing, or they're trying to convince people to adopt a certain sort of attitude, something like that. Now, you could say that's non-cognitive because they're not. It's not asserting a proposition, but it's not clear that it's not. It could go either way. They could achieve that goal by asserting a proposition or by expressing an attitude. So the point is that the communicative goal, like you could say, why are you saying this? Well, in order to persuade that person, or in order to achieve this goal, that isn't addressing the question of whether it's describing a stance-independent reality or not. It's not addressing the question of whether it's just expressing an emotion or not. It's simply not addressing the question at all. It's just not the purpose of that language. Same thing if someone says, I think it's going to rain tomorrow. If you really cashed out what they're doing, they're making a prediction about the likelihood of certain sorts of events being observed. And that doesn't require a commitment to any particular interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's just, I see it as the same thing. It's just that particular type of question that the philosopher is posing just doesn't figure into and isn't answered by an analysis of what the person is trying to do when they say something like murder is wrong in an everyday context. This is a good question. What do you think of Hummer's self-defeat argument for phenomenal conservatism? I don't know it. It sounds familiar. I think I may or may not have read that. I don't know it. So I need to know what the argument is. I'd be really curious to hear it. So if you're not already familiar, I talked about this last week. My primary objection to phenomenal conservatism isn't to say that phenomenal conservatism is false. It's to say that phenomenal conservatism is very, very easy to misuse. It's often used as a kind of epistemic blank check, a kind of goalpost shifting maneuver that superficially gives the appearance that you're being a fallibilist, that you're being epistemically modest, but in practice it functions as a kind of epistemic evidential trump card. What I mean by that, just to be very brief on this, because I've been talking for a long time now, is basically you could say, look, so phenomenal conservatism is this view that you're justified in believing that things are the way they seem in the absence of defeaters. So you have defeasible prima facie justification for believing that things are the way that they seem. And the way that it might work is I see a tree, I have some justification for believing there's a tree unless you give me compelling reasons to think that there isn't a tree. Now, that should function as a kind of epistemic starting point where you say, okay, well, it seems like there's a tree. And if you don't give me anything else, then I'm justified in thinking there's a tree. If you give me good reasons, then I'll stop believing there's a tree. If you show me that I'm in a virtual reality or I'm hallucinating or it's a fake tree, okay, I'll stop believing there's a tree. But in practice, what I see people doing is I see them will say something like, well, it seems to me that moral realism is true. And phenomenal conservatism, I'm justified in believing this in the absence of defeaters. So unless you present defeaters, then I'm justified in believing it. And then someone will present arguments and they'll go, that's not good enough because look, any argument against realism is less plausible than realism. And so once they do that, what they're not treating it as I get a point in favor of realism. And then if you present arguments against it, I can counter those arguments with rebuttals. They're in other words, they don't have to refute the arguments. So they start out with, I got 1 point in favor of realism. It seems true. And then you present a defeater and you say, oh, well, here's 10 points against realism. Here's a defeater against realism. Now, if they wanted to have an epistemically sort of like virtuous response, they would say, that's not a good argument. Here's why. It's not really 10 points. It's 0 points. It's a crap argument. Or they might say, it's only 1 point, so now we're tied. Or they might say, okay, fine, it's 10 points, but here's an argument, a positive argument in favor of realism, and that's 15 points. So it's now 16 to 10. I'm winning now. Now realism is the more plausible position. At least, given the initial input of my seemings, your mileage may vary given, your seemings. So, it could be that, for them, they don't have the 1 point. And if it came down to like 10 points for and against, and one is a seeming for and one is a seeming against, they'd both be justified in holding contrary views. Anyway, so that's not how people are using it in practice. What they're doing is you present your 10 points for anti-realism as a defeater, and they'll say, no, you don't understand. It super duper seems like realism is true. It's like 100 points in favor of realism. It's a very strong seeming. It's stronger than your defeater. So you could come back with them and say, look, I spent years coming up with these other defeaters like 1,000 points in favor of anti-realism, and they go, it's 10,000 points in favor of realism. It's super duper strong. So the point is, in practice, they don't actually give you a point system. There's no specificity about how strong the seeming in favor is, but it looks like in practice people treat their seemings as varying along a continuum of epistemic strength. And it's not like it's always like one unit of strength. It's not like we have some standardized evidence units for when we present defeaters and arguments for and against positions. It's treated as a moving target, and the moving target is always one step ahead of whatever your defeaters are. So what it allows for in practice is for people to just, it's just, no matter what somebody says, you could just say my seemings are stronger. And I think that that's a really lazy, crappy way to think. Now, that's not the fault of phenomenal conservatism, and it's not a legitimate use of phenomenal conservatism. It's just how people seem to be using it in practice. So as far as, but what I haven't done is raised any direct objections to arguing that phenomenal conservatism is wrong. And I'd like to see those. So if you could send me that paper, if it's in a paper or blog post, wherever it is, YouTube video, please send that to me, because I'd be happy to review that and discuss that, because I'd like to see some objections to phenomenal conservatism. I'm going to take one quick break, and it looks like I got a couple questions left. So I'll come back to those in 1 second. All right, I am back. Sorry, this has been the most distracted day. So it's been rough, all these interruptions and little stops. That's what happens when you live stream, I guess. Oh, that's no problem. I'm sorry about that. So part of my philosophy with these questions is, like, if people have questions or comments, I do my best to try to figure out what people mean, but I have become so focused on ambiguity and clarity and precision that sometimes I could be, I shouldn't say sometimes, I'm constantly super pedantic about things, and I want to be sure that I understand people, and I'm just always asking people for clarification. It's just something that I do. So it's no problem at all. And I thank you for clarifying. So awesome. Okay. But does moral anti-realism entail the rejection of non-moral epistemic facts? Or you just personally reject the non-moral epistemic facts? I don't think that it doesn't logically entail it. So there's a conceptual distinction between a sort of one's disbelief in moral anti-realism and why one disbelieves in moral anti-realism. So you could just not believe in moral anti-realism, and you could believe in epistemic realism. Someone might reason this way. Let's go back to phenomenal conservatism. In principle, someone could say this. Look, seems to me like epistemic realism is true, but it seems to me like it seems to me that epistemic realism is true, but it does not seem to me that moral realism is true. And so, in the absence of defeaters, I'm justified in believing epistemic realism, but not moral realism. And then nobody's given me any defeaters, so I endorse epistemic realism, but not moral realism. That's logically possible. There's no contradiction there. There's no problem with that in and of itself. Setting aside possible concerns with phenomenal conservatism and the possibility that there actually are defeaters for either of these positions. So you could think that way. You could think the reverse. You could think moral realism, it seems like that's true, but it doesn't seem like epistemic realism is true. It could seem to you that both are true. It could seem to you that neither are true. So, that could be the reason why you endorse one or the other of these positions, because it seems true. But it's also possible that the reason you don't endorse moral realism is more foundational. And it could be that same reason does entail that epistemic realism would be false as well. And that probably is true about my views. So I do take it to be, given my views, I am committed to epistemic realism also being false. I just grant that. And so on my view, so arguments for companions and Gill arguments will typically have a parity premise where they try to say that moral and epistemic realism stand or fall. And then they'll have another premise where you're supposed to not reject epistemic realism. And I think a lot of people might want to try to deny the parity premise. And the reason you might be motivated to deny that, and by motivated, I don't mean out of a bias. You could have some legitimate rational justification. would be to say, look, I reject moral realism, but I don't think that that entails a rejection of epistemic realism. Now, you could think that and think epistemic realism is true. So I think Richard Joyce might think this. I haven't got confirmation on that, but Richard Joyce is a contemporary error theorist. But in any case, it doesn't matter if Richard Joyce thinks that way or not, although that's an example of like a prominent person that might actually think that. But someone could say, look, I need to give a principled reason why we should reject moral realism that is sort of contained and doesn't apply to our reasons for rejecting epistemic realism. And you would need to come up with a good argument for that. You need to come up with reasons why we should reject moral realism, but not reject epistemic realism. And you may or may not be able to do that. I don't have a position on that. And part of the reason I don't have a position on that is similar to why, if, I'm an atheist, so I don't believe in gods. And if someone said, look, if, you're going to reject the existence of the Christian God, you would also have to reject, for similar reasons, the existence of, Zeus and Thor or something like that. And I don't care, because I don't believe in any of them. And so it's not a very motivating question for me to try to specifically give distinctive reasons for rejecting moral realism. I'm perfectly happy to just throw epistemic realism into the mix too and say I reject that as well. So it just doesn't seem to me to be worth the effort of trying to give contained rationales for rejecting moral realism while simultaneously partitioning off epistemic realism to conceptually cryopreserve it and not have it get destroyed alongside moral realism. What's the point? I just drop both of them. So on my view, I don't reject the parity premise in Companions of Gill arguments because I don't think that there's any theoretical costs. And so basically the history of this is I already rejected all forms of normative realism because I reject the idea of normative reasons. I reject the idea of categorical reasons. I reject the sort of foundational terms and concepts that are underwriting all forms of normative realism. And so the rationale that I had in mind would already apply to all forms of normative realism. So someone comes along and says, well, if you reject moral realism, you'd have to reject epistemic realism. Yeah, I do. I already rejected it. So someone's saying, yeah, but if you reject one, you have to reject both. Okay, well, I independently reject both. So I don't care. So I just reject the idea that there's any value in preserving or maintaining epistemic realism. So any premise that would say that you have to accept or there's some cost to if you have to accept epistemic realism or there's some cost to rejecting it, I just not only do I reject epistemic realism, I also categorically deny that there's any theoretical cost to doing so. So this is one difference between me and a lot of moral anti-realists. A lot of moral anti-realists will say, look, I'm an anti-realist in spite of it being counterintuitive. I deny that it's counterintuitive. And a lot of anti-realists would say, I'm an anti-realist in spite of the fact that it has these bullet biting implications. I deny that it has any bullet biting implications. I think anti-realism has literally no theoretical costs. And I mean that, literally none. That's how strong I adhere to anti-realism. No theoretical costs. No bullets are bitten. It just doesn't have any theoretical costs. I actually think there'd be enormous cost to accepting realism. I think realism amounts to endorsing in many cases, unintelligible stuff. So I don't even know how to assess it. But in any case, wildly implausible and totally superfluous. I don't think that there are any observations, any predictions we could or need to make, any practical value. I think it has no benefits at all, other than rhetorical benefits maybe. But in terms of describing what the world is like or accommodating anything, it just doesn't have any benefits. So yeah, I just don't think there's any theoretical cost to it. All right. Okay, great. Yeah, please do. I think the basic idea is that if you reject phenomenal conservatism, that leads to extreme skepticism because in Hume's account, beliefs are based on seemings. Is that supposed to be an objection to phenomenal conservatism? Yeah, I mean, so I'm probably just going to end up being a quietist about these sorts of concerns. So these kind of skepticism concerns just don't interest me. And when I say don't interest, I mean, I don't mean that I find them boring or something. It's that I think that the kinds of concerns that are motivating a lot of the traditional disputes between skeptics and anti-skeptics are just, they rely on conceptions of truth, knowledge, and justification that I don't accept. And so I just find the arguments kind of unmotivated and just they're caught up within the web of the analytic conception of terms and the use of terms and concepts that I don't accept. And so I don't think the arguments are substantive. So I'd probably end up taking some sort of like pragmatist route that just totally bypasses most of these disputes entirely. Like I just see them as pseudo problems and non-disputes. Okay, so I think that is going to do it. I think I covered everything. All right. So I do have my new closing thing that I'm supposed to use when I leave. So I have an outro. That's what it's called. So I have an outro. But I will say before I get into the outro is that please comment on the video. I want to give people prompts, but I didn't think of one. So just please comment on the content today. And that could be substantive content, questions, feedback, criticism. I don't care. Just comment about anything. You know, I want to get discussions going on my channel. I leave a lot of comments on other people's videos when they talk about moral realism and anti-realism or consciousness or whatever topic, metaphilosophy, psychology, whatever it is. So please leave a comment. If you don't want to leave a comment, that's fine. But do please, you know, like the video if you like the content. Subscribe if you're not already subscribed. I'd love to get some more subscribers, and I'm going to keep, you know, making this kind of content, this weird freeform content. I will be making some more recorded videos, and I'll still be rebroadcasting some of my appearances on other channels over the past year and a half now. It's been a while. So I'll be continuing to produce more content, and in a few months, I'll be really ratcheting up the content quite a bit more. So I'm going to start doing more recorded, like pre-planned videos, and that's going to be interviews, discussions, and just stuff where I discuss things in a more focused way, where it's edited and it's not just this sloppy mess where I get all tongue-tied and twist up my language and stumble over my words and say goofy things and have to leave the room 7 times and have to stop to get drinks. So you'll see some of that content. See, look at that. I can't talk anymore. That's what happens when I talk for 2 hours straight. I certainly do still have an interest in, if people want to join the live streams and hop in and have a conversation with me, that would be great. I do ask that you show your face before you do that. If you've done that a few times and I know who you are, that's fine. But the more sort of prior notice you give me, the better. I really just want to be sure if someone's going to come up onto the stage and talk, that we're going to talk about, you know, something productive and meaningful that's on topic. I don't want people to get up here and start like screaming at me that I endorse baby killing or some nonsense about that. I want to have productive, friendly conversations. I don't want to have goofy fights or have people come up here and not be serious. So if you want to come on and have a conversation with me, that'd be fantastic. So feel free to, you know, send me an email, comment, whatever it is, get in touch to do that. And yeah, so again, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. I can't even speak anymore. I guess I'm just too tired today. So I will catch you all later. See y'all, and thanks for joining me.